Testing 1 2 3, testing 1 2 3. Good morning. It's the 19th day of May. The time here in Oxford Mills is 9:08 a.m. The animals have all been fed. It's raining outside, and that's a good thing on a farm in the spring. Not all the time, but on the farm it's a good thing. I was up early. I did my usual dance with Bell Canada, who try to interfere with my posting on the net. Got a post on there, and now I'm ready to get back to doing something I used to do quite often in the past. Haven't done any of this videotaping, especially without an audience, for about 10 years now. But at the request of my friends in California, Barbara and Frank, I am fulfilling a need. I'm told that there be some information sent out in a format such as this disc will be, that will allow a number of people to hear what I have to say. If you hear a little bit of noise in the background, it's because I'm in the RV and the rain is falling on the roof, and that may interfere or may not. We'll see at the end whether or not it does. This message that I have to hand out to anyone who's interested in watching has to be taken in the context that I'm not asking anyone to believe without anything else but my word what I'm about to talk about. However, I think if you have an open mind, you should receive the information. Think about it for a period of time. Go through it on a event-by-event occurrence. Watch what happens on a day-to-day basis. And especially, like Barbara and Frank, if you happen to be in Southern California, it's very interesting that there is a relationship there to Pasadena and to Southern California. And it's basically a story about history that's not spoken about originally. Let me just say, to set the stage for this, that in 1987 to 1988, I began a journey to find out what life was really all about. I had had some difficulties with the government of Canada and high-ranking officials within the government that led me to file charges in a court of law against these individuals. Charges based upon my belief that there was, in practice, in Ottawa, a kickback scheme, and that the government had sent a cabinet minister to ask me for a bribe on the $160 million project that I had going at the time. Land had been purchased and financing had been arranged through large pension funds. this $160 million project would have been a city within a city type of place, demonstrating the technologies of communications. To make that long story short, when I refused to pay, and what they wanted was 5%, I was taken to court by my partners who tried to remove me from the project. However, I won in court, but the fallout from that caused the investors to reassess what they were doing, and the project died before it was completed. The land was sold by my partners to Bell Canada, and I began to suspect later on that maybe this arrangement to transfer a prime piece of real estate in the national capital to Bell Canada had been arranged before my entire activity on my project was approved, and my project was a means to an end for Bell Canada to end up in the end with the land they required for purposes that we'll discuss as we go along. In discussing this activity, I have to stop here and make a little personal comment, because certainly everyone who knew me and have known me for years as a businessman in a three-piece suit have seen changes occur in my demeanor over the years, not the least of which was my going to Parliament Hill in Ottawa and spending 1,000 days as what I described as an outdoor lobbyist, asking the politicians to stop stealing. The event eventually went to court, and 16 members of the government, including the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, were formally accused by the courts with participating in a conspiracy that would defraud the Canadian people of a sum of money which I believe to be in excess of Canada's national debt. In any event, after the initial 10-year investigation and the dropping of the charges by the friends of the politicians in government, I became aware that what I was dealing with here in Ottawa was not solely restricted to Ottawa or to Canada, but was an international fraud. And many people who had known me up to that stage would be totally surprised to see me with all of this hair. And I have to explain before I begin here that I am now participating in a project designed to identify the DNA, strands of DNA found in my hair, including the beard, which I am told is different in its composition than the hair on the head. Hair, I've discovered, is basically the scientific equivalent of what religion calls the soul. Hair contains DNA. And the DNA connections to the brain and to the spine are obvious to the scientists who research this. Of course, in the Bible, there's the story of Samson and Delilah, and the fact that when she supposedly cut off his hair, he lost his physical strength. In reality, that's more an allegory to describe losing your connection to the past, so that you can be reprogrammed for a different purpose in the future. We have gray matter residing in our brain and gray matter residing in our spine. Spine gray matter is the memories of our life on earth as the ancient person beginning the trek to become modern man. And the lessons learned are carried in there, and those lessons can be described as intuition, whereas the lessons learned in the brain are more linked to reasoning. Well, the people who knew me a long time ago would know that I wore normal hair, had no beard, and was about as business-oriented a person as one could get. Set out on a trek to raise $160 million to build a project, and eventually was successful in that. Had the land purchased, cleared, built a school, replacement school for the project that I had. So they would be totally shocked in looking at Glen Kealey today, wearing hair down to his shoulders. But I've discovered that in order for me to get the whole picture that I'm looking for in the history of mankind, I had to allow my hair to grow, allow some investigators, scientists in a laboratory to do some testing and discover what information can be found from my hair. But I also wanted to find out if it assisted my intuitive skills and matched up with the reasoning skills that I had to observe, analyze, conclude based upon the facts that I found around me. And at this stage of the game, I am not totally certain of the connection. I feel there is one, but there is still more work to be done along that line. There certainly is no work to be done along the lines of understanding what the bigger picture is, because I, along the way, found and got access to a written code which I deciphered, known as the Desdemona Code, which outlines in pictograph form, using the letters of the English Latin alphabet, and tells a story both in the numbers and in the letters of how the people who are in charge of our world set about to take control, and what the long-term purpose of setting about on this task is. So in order for me to explain to you our trek as human beings through a 60,000 year period, as opposed to the 6,000 year period that religion would like you to believe, I'm going to have to try to break this down into a few component parts, and I'm going to be skimming over the top of many pieces of information that I have deciphered using this code over the period of the last 10 years or so, 1998 to 2008. And I hope you'll forgive me for not going into detail, because if you want detail, then you'll have to come here to the farm and we can begin by a workshop, as we did with Barbara and Frank, and move from there in a step-by-step, because this whole process is so vast that it has to be absorbed through osmosis over a period of time to really grasp the significance of it all. But I'm going to try and give it to you in a format that will allow you to grasp the major points of what I've learned at this point in time, which is 20 years into my search. And we all know that 2020 is when you see clearly, and that's coming down the line 12 years from now. And maybe with what you will hear today, it will help you, I don't want to say understand, because the code suggests that you should overstand rather than understand. Even some ecclesiastics would say you must verstand the direction in which you're going. And the word stand, of course, includes the letters DNA in there, which is a story that I'm about to tell you. I call it the crossvine ruse. A crossvine you can think of as a method of getting around an obstacle. And in the trek human beings have taken along the way, and in our controllers' attempts to control our activity, they had to design ways of getting around the problem by either going right or by going left, going over the top, or by going underneath. Tarzan, the movie Tarzan, is suggestive of getting through a large forest by swinging from branch to branch, by in fact going down below and coming back up at another place. And that's significant. It's also significant that he was, like Remus and Romulus, apparently raised by an animal. And the animal is suggestive of the day back a long, long time ago, hundreds of thousands of years ago, when a division occurred in the evolutionary line of an animal, and that division then created two significant new animals, one of which we know today as human beings, and the other one not known to most people but understood by scientists, the Neanderthaler. the Neanderthal animal and the human animal having had the same basic connection before the division occurred. And then the human animal continued on one path while the Neanderthaler animal went in another direction. If scientists are correct, all of this began in northeastern Africa, in an area around Eritrea, today's Eritrea, and down to what we would call Somalia, what we call Somalia today. So let me begin by saying that these two animals were not living together at the beginning, although they were living concurrently in the same general area of North Africa, and some would say north of the Mediterranean and around the Mediterranean. And of course, we're talking about a time prior to the last ice age. And for 84,000 years, if the scientists are correct, there were no men in the human animal. The mitochondrial DNA suggests that the original woman, which we will, for purposes of naming, call Lilith, was a hermaphrodite. A hermaphrodite that could, in fact, give birth of clones of herself, and did so for a period of about 84,000 years, until at about 90,000 BC, a development came about when the woman called Lilith had, in fact, reached a point where she had too many duties in a day and needed to subdivide herself into two people so that she could continue in her duties while a second version called men would be born. And that second version would be task-oriented, and the tasks would be assigned by the Lilith person to this group of men, and that's where you began getting the division, of course, of gender and reproduction over time by sex rather than through the internal hermaphroditic way, which, by the way, is not something that is not seen quite regularly, as the flatworm can be a great example of that type of beginning. A flatworm going through the ground has little or no chance of ever coming across another flatworm along the way because of the fact that you can't even see where you're going while you're traveling through the earth. And being a hermaphrodite allowed the species to continue. And for the human species at the time of Lilith by herself, that was an important development in that animal, that she could, in fact, give birth by herself. But as I said, and I'm trying to make a long story short here, there came a point where a division was needed and creation who has all kinds of secrets from what is happening on this planet, not the least of which is the Big Bang and how it all began, and what's its intention, and was there one before, and is this a continuation of something that happened many times in the past, or is this activity something new? My personal interpretation of what has happened is that creation knows everything. However, creation has never experienced anything. And the creation of life on planet Earth is basically an experiment by creation to figure out exactly what advantages there would be to creation, not only to know, but to have experienced. And every grain of sand, every blade of grass, every cloud in the sky, every tree, every bird, every animal, every person is a collector of information. And that information is gathered up and stored in a way that can be retrieved by the universe, by creation. And note, I do not mean God. We'll get to God later. Creation is not a person, but a process through which we got to where we are today. God is a hijacker of that process, in my opinion, but we'll have to get into the details of that later on. So, creation devised DNA as one of the methods of receiving and storing information and passing it on from one part of life to another part of life. And therefore, the saying, you are what you eat, does have some significance in the transfer of DNA from past life to new life. Someone dies, obviously, when they're converted back into the chemistry of what life was all about. It can be absorbed by grass, and grass can be eaten by a goat or a calf or a cow, and there is some transfer of information through that process to the secondary level, and then if someone comes along later on and eats that animal, there is again an amount of transfer into what I believe to be the gray matter in the spine of the ancient history, and the part that forms intuition rather than reason. And we know that women were well documented as having somewhat much better intuition than did men, and in trying to find out what the difference was in their makeup, women seem to have better antennas for working these things out. And if one notices women's hair, especially in the past, in the tribes, the Indian tribes in the past, the hair was much longer than that of men. So when I look at the square that graduates receive from universities when they graduate, I think it's noteworthy that it's designed to cover the hair and replace it with an artificial tassel that represents the hair that was on the head, so that the information the person has received comes from a source which is different than where intuition comes from. I note as well that in carrying a fetus to term, it's suggested to women that they take folic acid in fairly large doses in order to prevent one specific mental disease, illness, that might come about, which has to do with the spine. And that may be correct. However, it's like throwing the baby out with the bathwater, in my view, because what you're basically doing is preventing all the people from gaining access to information for the purpose of preventing one person from being sick, maybe one in a million, from becoming ill because of that condition that is inherent in that process. One then would have to ask, is the loss equal to the possible gain? And I certainly don't believe that it is. In any event, that DNA that is resident within the gray matter of the spine gave the women a store of information that they could not get anywhere else. And for that purpose, even though the genders were divided and you now had a man and woman link up for the purpose of making a child, the woman remained under her title of clan mothers, earned from having given birth. She remained basically the leader along with the other women in the clan, while the male was more task-oriented. There is little information known about the journey of the other animal called the Neanderthaler, because I believe the information is being withheld. It's not that it doesn't exist, it's just that it's being withheld and released only to certain groups of people, and the information released in a coded form to the agents of the Neanderthaler. By the way, the word Neanderthaler is subdivided into two parts. Neand is the word Dean. Dean, Dino, Dina, as in Pasadena, are all names that come into play here and suggest that the Neanderthaler didn't disappear forever and ever, but basically disappeared for a purpose. And the purpose can be better understood if one goes over to the other division of the word Neanderthaler, and that the word Thaler is the German word for dollars. So the word Neanderthaler can be interpreted in English using this code, and this is where I learned to use this code that came to North America in the late 1800s with the Eastern European immigrants that traveled to North America to take over the land from the first immigrants, the native people, so-called native people of America, and prepare it for a future food cartel where the control over people would be done through food. The word Neanderthaler therefore translates to deans of dollars. Dean of dollars. Neand, dean, and can also be Odin if one were Scandinavian, or Dino for Italians. Dina is the example of Pasadena, for example. And the Rose Parade, one will find out later on, is basically the main method of communications to the agents that work for Neanderthalers in America through the imagery and through the activity. I could make a whole tape on this year's 2008 Rose Bowl Parade, and we're going to have to skim over it here because effectively this will be a fairly long tape to make as it is without going into too many details. However, the Neanderthaler is known for a few things in particular. The name given to his society is that of Moostrian. And the Moostrian society in the mountains, the Pyrenees and the southern western side of France and Spain, the Moostrian caves are known to contain a lot of artwork, paintings, and artifacts that suggest that the Moostrians, the Neanderthalers, brought forth fire to Europe and Africa, and that fire led to cooking. And cooking in their format would basically be making a stew, either a fish stew or a stew of vegetables and pieces of meat, animals that they would find locally. And in order to do the cooking, they had to come up with an invention which suggests the beginning of their activity, and that's the spear. And if one follows the code through, which we don't have time to go into detail today, you would, of course, get to a place in our history where shaking the spear becomes important as a marker along the way to development, and that leads you to the name of Will.I.am Shakespeare. A book of codes that allows those in the know to access information about the past that is not discussed in normal universities around the world, but is discussed in specialized universities aimed at a clientele of clerics and monarchs and leaders of the world, and links in the way to the future called roads to the future with RHODES as opposed to the roads we are shown. And that information gained about cooking and spears leads us to the third most important development, and that is clothes. And since spearheads were modified at one stage of the game to become scrapers of animal skins, that has enabled scientists to follow the track where, because it was cold in the northern part of the Mediterranean especially, and in order to survive over the winter period, animal skins were used as clothing. So the Neanderthaler, a person linked to cooking, a person linked to weapons, a person linked to clothing, is living a concurrent life to the human life that is happening in the Afar Triangle of Ethiopia, that basic district. And at one stage of the game, 84,000 years after the arrival of woman, the division of the genders occurs, and one stage later on, the entry or the coming together of the two basic groups, Neanderthalers and human beings, occurs prior, I would suggest, from what I've been able to decipher, at a period somewhere around 60,000 BC. And for a while, they basically share activities. There's a suggestion that among the Neanderthalers, there is a significant number of people whom today we would refer to as idiot savant. I guess the most famous movie made recently is The Rain Man with Tom Cruise. And it suggests that in the Neanderthal group, there is a certain group of people whose brains function on a much higher level than the rest of the people, and especially of the clan mothers and their men and that society. However, the price they pay for having access to that much higher level of intellect on a very specific part of knowledge is that they become lower in their abilities on the other side, on practically everything else, and therefore they need assistance from the human species in order to pursue a normal, quite difficult to use the word normal, but a life beyond what they would be able to do on their own. In a clan society, in order for you to understand how it was designed to function, it's a small group. I would suggest always less than a few hundred people, maybe even less than that. And once the they expand beyond that, a group splits off and goes off and lives somewhere else. Probably 20 miles is the distance that anyone would travel in a diameter out from the middle at any time in their lives. But here we're talking about thousands and thousands and thousands of years. See, we live in a mindset that doesn't quite grasp what thousands of years are all about. I can tell you, for example, that back at the time of Jesus, 2,000 years ago or so, and you can somewhat imagine how far away that is. But if I said to you that Neanderthalers and human beings kind of came together and shared space in 60,000 BC, that's 30 times that length of time that we're thinking of. And that's a hell of a long time, and difficult for most modern people to grasp. They understand, however, how we have progressed so dramatically in the last 350 years, going through the development of an industrial age into a technological age that we have today, and the difference between those two periods. And yet modern people can't ask themselves the question, why is it that we are told by our educators that ancient man, prior to the Ice Age, was a caveman with absolutely no technological abilities? And yet we see things, if you get a chance to watch a very good series on television made by the BBC called Around the World in 80 Treasures by a guy called Cruikshank. Kind of fits in with the name Ruse, Cruikshank, Ruse. He describes some of the ancient treasures found on Earth, some less ancient, modern as a matter of fact, and he travels the world in each program visiting 8 or 10 of these different sites. And one has to believe that although we're told that these what appear to be pretty dumb cavemen residing in their caves as the only thing they could do was feed themselves, even if they needed help to do that. It doesn't make sense to anyone that has a functioning brain. Reasoning, even without the intuition, would tell you that you don't build the pyramids unless you have some knowledge of hydraulics, for example. How do you lift those stones? How do you cut those stones? How do you move them? And going all the way back to the activities in Tibet, for example, and underground cities in Turkey and the rest of the Middle East, suggests that there had to be someone with a little more knowledge than what we have seen develop since a time in the 1500s, for example, the Renaissance, which itself is a word meaning rebirth, that suggests that there were things happening before that have been basically put aside. And we were bumped back during a period called the Dark Ages, away from the knowledge we used to have. And now there's a rebirth that occurs in the 13th to 1600s. And most of it is simply a transfer of concepts, technology, out of the Far East through the adventures of Marco Polo, for example, and the explorers that go to China and Japan and India. This bringing and transferring this technology to the Medici family is important in the stage that was known as the Enlightenment in Florence and Italy, the making of Italy. But that comes way, way down the line, away from where we're discussing Neanderthalers back 59, 60,000 years BC. And it's hard, I guess, to sometimes put your head around the fact that these two groups of people, humans and Neanderthalers, lived side by side, although separately, for a long period of time, until they got into a fight. And basically, in a colony where clan mothers rule the show because they've earned that right by giving birth to the members of the clan, one can imagine that the men are out hunting and foraging to bring back food or building houses or places where people can stay and have their meals, houses for the clan mothers and the children, that kind of thing. But at night, around the campfire, they sit, clan mothers sit there at the center as politicians, as judges of activity, and they open the floor to the clan and say, well, how did things go on today? And people describe their day, and occasionally there are complaints about the activity of a certain individual. And in a clan society, an individual who has injured someone else and is judged to have done so is punished by the clan mothers by eviction for a temporary period of time, depending upon the offense. For example, if someone had stolen something from somebody else and was admitting to that fact, they might be evicted to go live on an island someplace 10 or 15 miles away, or in a part of the forest where they have no contact with the clan for a period of time until they are retrieved and brought back in, and that could be a month or two. And one can understand how devastating that is for a person who is whose only contact with human beings is through the clan, and then being sent to live alone with animals can be very, very disconcerting to that person. But eventually they would be retrieved and reintegrated into the clan. And yet if on a second occasion they had repeated that kind of activity, the penalty might be extended into a period of time which would be equivalent to years. And that would be a terrible experience for a person to live alone and not be retrieved for years. And of course, there always has to be a limit, so strike three comes about if for a third time this activity is repeated. The person would be evicted for life, and should the person choose to return to the clan before the end of their lives, they would in fact be ending their lives, because the fourth final penalty, the last resort, would be death. So these clan mothers, receiving information from the individuals in the clan, begin to get complaints from the clan about the treatment being given to children by the Neanderthals. And over thousands of years, not a few days, this relationship that has come together begins to break down. And eventually the clan mothers have to send the Neanderthalers away to live in another part. And if one considers, say, Africa, Eritrea, and the space around it, which have different names these days, being plains and flatland, and the mountains being in Somalia, south of them, still, of course, north of the equator, but south of the Sudan, Eritrea area, Kenya today, that area. If the Neanderthalers are sent to live in the mountains, they are basically evicted as a group. And the material in the code and the activities one can decipher by reading through dictionaries. For example, here's a big dictionary, or Bible, because these are basically code books. When secret society members carry their Bible around, it's not because they believe the Bible to be a religious manual. Instead, they believe it to be a coding manual, and that's why they're placed in hotels, so when they're out of town and they get a secret message, they could look up, say, Luke chapter 2, verses 48 to 49, which would suggest that they have to be about the work assigned to them by a power higher than they are, and get to it. Neanderthalers became jealous of clan mothers. And in their jealousy, they began to plan a war against women. Now, there is no evidence on the planet that I have been able to locate that suggests that full-blown war was ever contemplated until about 10,000 BC, which is at the end of the last ice age. And yet the problems with the Neanderthals and the humans had begun to surface at about 59,000, 5,800, 800 BC, and evolved into full-blown hatred by the Neanderthals of the clan mothers by a period of about 40,000 BC, and a decision to do something about it was made at a time somewhere between 30 and 25,000 BC. A serious decision, but that required changes to occur to the Neanderthaler themselves. The coding suggests that over time, an evolution of knowledge occurred among Neanderthalers at a rate much faster than that acquired by human beings. And the suggestion that comes through intuition and the coding structure is that a computer in the form of human beings was assembled. Now this may sound a little strange, and I'm not asking anyone to believe me without doing any research of your own, but how I have been able to view this in a more modern fashion is by looking at a vehicle, a motor vehicle, and seeing the distributor cap function and how it connects together the activity of 8 different cylinders, making it possible to cause one cylinder to go down while another one goes up, and everything done in sequence allows more power to be developed than could be developed by any other method. They might tell you that it has 800 horsepower, for example, this motor. So there is a cumulative effect of being able to interconnect into a single center the power generated by the individual activities of a cylinder. Going back to the Neanderthaler, and the fact we know that they had a very significant number of idiot savants, one should try to imagine the creation of a chemical computer that was able to link to the savant part of a brain while ignoring the idiot part of the brain. And if you could do that with significant numbers, the number suggested is 144,000 savant sections into one place, you might be able to develop a computer way beyond what we know today. It's significant that in the genome, the numbers 125 to 145,000 suggest the total instructions that are involved with DNA, the genes. And the genome is designed to name each one and identify their very basic and specific purposes and how they come together and how few of them are used in making a human being function, for example. Figures that I've been told are that although there are over 100,000 different instructions in DNA form, a human being, a single human being, operates with 25,000 of these instructions. So think of yourselves as being made up of 25,000 information bits, of which you in fact only need maybe 3,000 or 4,000 to function, and the others are in reserve and not basically being used today. It's a long story, genetic engineering, and I can't stop at this moment in time to identify everything that is possible in that stage. But let me just try to describe how the Neanderthaler would have made their way to that place. They were living in mines. Their mines were the result of having found minerals in the caves that they habitated in. And as mineralogy became known, and it would have to be known when one would develop the next stage away from stone into a metal head for an arrow or a spear, for example. And some metals would prove to be more flexible and easier to manage. Metallurgy was probably the first industrial activity that developed while Neanderthalers lived in caves, whether it be in France, in Germany, in the Middle East, or the original caves in Somalia. One thing you learn about in metallurgy is that no metal is basically pure. If it is melted down, molten metal can be broken down into its component parts, and one finds different structures that can be separated out of the metal to give different elements, and that those elements can be recombined to make a different product than the one began with. It's basic chemistry. If one has that general knowledge, and one then asks the question, well, if you can break down metals to their basic component parts, is it not possible to break down vegetable? And testing proved that it could. These are guys that had a lot of time on their hands. They either worked at the mining, at the chemistry side of things, or they stood up on top of the mountain, studied the skies, and wrote down where stars were on any single night, and over a period of thousands of years started to understand precession and the fact that everything always kind of goes around and comes back to where it was, and started making calendars of events and stuff like that. So these are communities with a lot of time on their hands, and they wanted a method, basically, of storing the information they were gathering so that it would be available from one generation to the next. Chemistry, botany, all chemicals mixed together, brought them around to one day saying, hey, look, if it's in metal, if it's in vegetable, should it not therefore be the premise of animal? And of course, from animal, humans. And the development over time of an understanding of this chemistry. And of course, I'm simplifying things, and I'm shortening the time, because these people had all kinds of time in the world. And there are many things that were done prior to the Ice Age that suggest could not be done unless they had a computer. And of course, the most natural computer they had were brains. And the brains of idiot savants, the savant part, being the most important part. And if you could get to communicate between all of these and make them into one central computer that would hold all of the information that could be retrieved, you can imagine the pace at development you would get in the Neanderthal community to what you would get in the community of human beings. And of course, human beings depended upon manual storage of information, and that could always be destroyed by somebody who snuck around and lit a fire or sent water rushing in that would flood the place. And like we see today in Burma, people fall back into the Stone Age, basically. You get the same thing in central China with the earthquake, when they're left with nothing of what they're used to getting. They have to start history all over again. Well, thankfully today there are people beyond that danger point that can then come in and assist. But you can imagine 50,000 BC, there were no other people. So basically whatever was learned by a certain community would be destroyed and people would start over again. So these guys in the mountains, they had one hell of an advantage. And while they were there, some of them came up with the idea that why should they do any work, physical work, when all of these people down there could in fact be conscripted into a force of individuals working together on the Neanderthalers' behalf. And they began by kidnapping children. Children, especially little boys, could be used to enlarge caves. They were bringing in a lot of stuff they had to store, so enlarged caves was something that had to be done. And if you could get the boys from the village to come up permanently and do that, that would be great. My suggestion is that these mothers' sons is the origin of the stonecutter today, which we call Ma's sons, Masons. Priests have power today, but they had to gain that power somehow. Ecclesiastics, which basically encompasses all the sects of priests, monks, reverends, whatever you want to call them, around the world in the religions that exist, all have a function, and that is to be an intermediary between creation, supposedly the creator, and the individual. Yet, we know that creation is a process, not a person. And we have to come to terms with the fact that someone along the line wanted to control people, and to control people, that someone had to pretend to be creation, the creator. Well, in a world of hunters and foragers, the only slave that existed at the beginning was a dog. And someone could throw a spear or shoot an arrow and kill a bird or a rabbit and send the dog out to retrieve it. Have you ever asked yourself the question, how come on an Apple computer, when you say fetch, you see the icon of a little dog going away, coming back and picking up what you're looking for and bringing it back? I suggest it's symbolic of the original way of getting things. In mythology, in the image of Gula, which is a priest dressed as a woman, sitting in a chair, has a dog. And the word dog priest applies here. So priests are agents who go and fetch things and bring them back to the superior. The superior is the top dog. And the top dog suggests that if you reverse the word dog, you have the word God. So God sends out his dog to fetch things from the community and bring it back. How do you get someone to volunteer to give things? Well, if you're the Neanderthaler and you've been studying the stars and you've been watching this for 40, 50,000 years, you have a sense of what tomorrow's sky is going to look like. You have a sense of what eclipse is going to happen. And therefore, you can sneak underground, come up in a big tree, or under someone's log cabin, and whisper, "I am God. I want you to do this, that, or the other thing on my behalf. Or if you don't, I'll be angry. I'll be very, very angry. So angry that I can turn off the sun at noon hour tomorrow if you haven't done what I've asked you to do by then. And the person shudders at the sound of the voice. Oh, what's going on? And all of a sudden on the next day it is, it was a dream. But when noon comes around, an eclipse occurs, fear of the unknown creeps in and plays a role in the humans who have no sense whatsoever about the technology available to the Neanderthalers, the Deans of Dollars, and are fooled by that. And some of the things that would be asked for would be, I want your children. You can't have my children. My children are my children. I want a boy. I need somebody to do some work. Parent says, no. A flood comes in, kills the children. The word gets around. Hey, if you're asked to do something and you don't do it, this guy gets pissed off. And really, really pissed off. I'm told he even one day decided to create the Black Sea above Turkey. And that caused the ocean level to drop around the world by 11 inches so that 200 and some feet of water could fill that valley. Red Sea used to be the Red River. Eden was in the Gulf of Arabia. Don't believe me? Keep it in mind. I'm feeding you basically toothpaste on your hand. You can wash it off. You can brush your teeth with it. One thing you can't do is put it back in the tube. It's there. And for the rest of your life, you'll have to deal with the memory of what you heard today. Over time, it was discovered that the best weapon of all was soma, Somalia soma, a drug made from the roots of a plant, a hallucinogen. And that gave Neanderthalers a hint that if they wanted to control people, they could break down their society by getting people addicted to drugs. Lest ye forget, on the 11th of November every year, soldiers are remembered by the use of a flower called Father Poppy. But yet, when you look at it, it is a symbol of opium, mostly grown in Afghanistan, where a war is going on today. But I've gone too far ahead here. So you have a bunch of people who want power over women. How do you get power over women? First of all, you start to dress like them and have your agents dress like them. So men that dress women. Men that dressed like women. What have we got today? Asians, Arabs, priests, nuns, Scotsmen wear kilts, judges wear robes, politicians wear robes, scientists wear robes. The word robe is a French word for dress. It's a dress. So dressing up like a woman became part of their plan. If you're going to transfer the allegiance of the people away from the clan mother to the priest, there's got to be some symbolism there attached in the way they dress. Your links to creation, as far as they're concerned, are the most powerful. Your ability to destroy them through drugs is another feature. There's no doubt that after the Eastern Europeans came to North America, the North American government attempted to prevent alcohol from being distributed, and automatically that meant that another government north of it was set up in such a way with the sellers of alcohol coming in from Europe, first of all settling in Montreal, then moving to Winnipeg, and from Winnipeg setting up a distribution center we know today as organized crime, led by a guy called Al Capstone, the top guy for setting up this criminal organization, which would be a counterbalance to the government. The government would make rules against certain things. The criminal organization would give you ways of defying these rules. And this polarization of the population is what became understood as the best weapon of all. If you can have a middleman saying, these people are right, these people are wrong, or these people are doing what these people should be doing, and then controlling a certain number of people in the middle by polarizing the two teams on either side, you can get to control yourself in the middle. And that's basically what priests, monks, reverends do. And in order for each group to be task specific, sometimes you have to subdivide the group. So the Hindu, for example, subdivided away from itself. The Jainism division, the Buddhist division, the Jerusalem gang was divided into the Judean division, the Christian division, the Islamic division, each one having their own task. Again, I'm moving too far ahead because here we have this group of people who understand the basic structure of alchemy, metallurgy, botany, chemistry, and genome, DNA. And they decide that it would be a great idea if only they didn't have to deal with these two groups of individuals, men and female, male and female, and could return to the day when there was just one group and so busy it can't handle everything, almost like married women who live at home are today. They have more tasks than is physically possible in a day's work. So they decide that they want to infiltrate into this women's community, find out their secrets and how they could go about by undermining their activity. In nature, there are always exceptions to the rule. And therefore, in the life of human beings, there is a small portion of the population that normally is born different. That small portion of the population began by being gay. Some of the males had the genome a little bit crossed up naturally and ended up wanting to be more like mom than like dad. And that small group of people, which is approximately 5%, if they could be brought in to assist the priests in infiltrating the women's coffee clubs, secret meetings, way, way back in a time 40,000 BC, that would be helpful. These people who were gay, some of them, most of them had an affinity for women, but not on the sexual side, therefore were not threats to the women, and could be basically considered part of the same group. If one looks at a program on TV these days, Sex in the City, its demographics suggest that its audience was basically women and gay people. And hopefully they can expand that audience by, I say hopefully, by the people who are making these programs, expand the audience by making a movie that would bring in a new audience. But there is an affinity there between the women and the gays, an affinity that reared its presence when a lot of the crusade warriors came back, having spent their time living with a group of men. They were now too old to be with the men. The fighting just wasn't in them. But because their families were wealthy people, it was easy for them to switch from the soldier warrior to the priest warrior and simply put on the dress of a priest and act accordingly. And that allowed for them to approach women, especially the widows of the soldiers who had died in the Middle East, and say, look, we understand you have a problem with all these soldiers coming back and they are attacking the women sexually. We can provide you with a structure that would be defensive against this activity by creating what we would call a dual monastery. So all the widows could come to a place that looks something like a barbell, and the women would be on one side, and they would have functions, and we, their defenders, would be on the other side, the priests, and we would meet in the middle, and you would have some functions, and we would have some functions. But sex is not something that you would be faced with coming at you from outside. If you wanted sex, you would have to have it with other women as we have sex with other men, or you would have to leave or go outside. And that basically is is how the dual monastery began following the Crusades. Of course, once the men came in and built up their empire of monasteries, many of them kicked the women out just so that they would have the monasteries on their own. And we see a lot of men-only monasteries, and certainly the Vatican espouses a men-only tradition or women-only tradition, and women are given the most menial jobs. They call them nun. It's not an accident that the letters to the French word un, which means one, is the name given to these women, because one was the definition of a hermaphrodite before she divided. She was both man and woman. And not an accident either that the United Nations is also called UN. By the way, I was born and brought up in a Roman Catholic family, and was involved directly in providing my labor and services to the church in things like the St. Vincent de Paul Society, until one day I woke up. But that's another story. Men could make use, if they were priests, dressed like women, of gay men. A good place to hide behind. A good place to shove out in front and make them appear as if they are the majority. Not an accident today. We're seeing a lot of exposure of gay men in the community of priests, any religion around the world. They're the ones who are singled out and pushed out in the public as the guilty parties. Nobody ever says anything about the ones in the background who are basically the ones who are at war with the women. In any event, genetically speaking, a natural thing can be enhanced. By breaking down the genome, one is able to find out what instructions were included in the zygote or the egg that made this gay person gay, and replicate that artificially in assembling another egg. Think about cloning as a bartender who sits in front of 144,000 bottles, each one having a specific instruction, and they begin to make a cocktail. Well, they have to get an egg from an existing woman, open it up, throw out her material, and then go through assembling 25,000 bits and pieces of information and closing it back out, and then they need a surrogate mother in which to implant this egg so it can be carried to term, and a nunnery in the beginning would be a great place to have that happen. God wants it that way, and everybody knows that what God wants, God gets. And bring into the world a number exceeding normal in the community of gay people. Normal, say, being 5%. You can now travel to places in Austria or Australia, for example, where you get 10 or 15% of the people who are gay. It's just a genetic thing. It's the cocktail, and they didn't choose to be that way any more than I chose to be who I am. They were just assembled and inserted and carried to term. That gave the priests an advantage. It allowed a certain number of people, and not all of them, but a certain number, 5% of the 5%, to act on their behalf and penetrate into societies of women, especially in a place like a harem, for example, or a clan mother's meeting, and gather information that might not be available to the enemies, known enemies of women. Another approach at a later date would be to take the formula that would normally be a gay man and remove the Y chromosome, so that what you end up with a lesbian, what you end up with is a lesbian, and a lesbian has an advantage over a gay man when it comes to penetrating female society. The reason, of course, being the priest, the monk, the rabbi, the reverend, the people in charge of their organizations are at war. And they're at war with women. They want the power which resides in Clan Mother to reside in them, because they want to rule. Power is the Aphrodite